Imagine watching your best friend, the one who has been by your side through everything, fighting for his life, slipping away before your eyes. That was Max, a loyal German shepherd who had spent years protecting and loving his owner. Now, he lay on a cold veterinary table, his body weak, his breathing shallow. The vets had given up hope. His eyes, once full of life, had faded into emptiness. And then, when his owner couldn't hold back his tears any longer, Max did something that no one could have expected. What happened in that moment changed everything, and I promise you, this will bring you to tears. The veterinary clinic was quiet, except for the steady beeping of medical monitors. The air smelled of antiseptic, a stark contrast to the warmth and familiarity of home. On the cold metal examination table lay Max, a 12-year-old German shepherd, his once powerful body now frail and unmoving. His ribs were faintly visible beneath his thinning fur, his breathing shallow and uneven. The strong, protective dog that had once stood proudly beside his owner now lay silent, weak, and fading. Beside him, Ryan Carter, a 41-year-old man with short, dark hair and tired eyes, sat hunched over in a chair, gripping Max's paw with trembling fingers. His throat felt tight, and his chest ached with the weight of reality. Max was dying, and there was nothing he could do. Dr. Evans, the clinic's lead veterinarian, stood nearby, his expression grim. He had seen this scene too many times before, the moment when owners clung to hope that simply wasn't there anymore. He cleared his throat. "Ryan, we've done everything we could." Ryan barely acknowledged him. His eyes remained locked on Max, searching for something, anything, that told him this wasn't the end. But Max didn't move. His once bright brown eyes stared blankly ahead, unfocused. His chest barely rose with each shallow breath. The IV in his paw dripped fluids that weren't helping anymore. Ryan swallowed hard. "He's a fighter," he whispered, more to himself than to the vet. Dr. Evans exhaled softly. "I know, but even fighters have limits." The words hit Ryan like a punch to the gut. His mind raced backward, flashes of moments, memories of a lifetime spent together. He remembered the day he brought Max home as a puppy, his tiny paws too big for his body as he tumbled across the floor. The long walks at sunset, Max's ears perked up at every sound. The stormy nights when Max would press himself against Ryan's legs, always watching over him. The nights when Ryan was at his lowest, when life had broken him down, and Max had been the only one who stayed, resting his head in his lap as if silently saying, "I'm here." And now, after 12 years of unwavering loyalty, Max was slipping away, and Ryan couldn't stop it. Ryan's vision blurred as he ran a hand through Max's fur, barely feeling the warmth that was fading fast. He had tried to be strong, tried to hold it together, but the thought of walking out of this clinic alone, without Max beside him, was unbearable. A sharp breath caught in his throat, and then the first tear fell. It landed softly on Max's paw. Ryan's shoulders trembled as more followed, his grip on Max tightening as if he could somehow keep him from leaving. "Please, just give me one more sign," Ryan whispered, his voice breaking. The beeping of the monitors slowed. Max's breathing weakened further, and just as Ryan thought he was watching his best friend slip away forever, Max did something that no one expected. Ryan's breath hitched as Max's chest barely moved beneath his trembling hands. The beeping of the monitor slowed, each sound like a countdown to the inevitable. He was slipping away. Ryan squeezed his eyes shut, his fingers tightening around Max's paw. "Please, don't go." His voice was barely above a whisper, cracking under the weight of helplessness. And then, something happened. A faint twitch. At first, Ryan thought he imagined it. But then, Max's paw moved. It was weak, barely more than a reflex. But it was there. Ryan's heart pounded as his eyes snapped to Max's face. His dog, who had been so still for so long, was trying to move. His breathing, though shallow, had steadied just enough to make Ryan freeze. Dr. Evans, who had already begun to prepare himself for the inevitable, paused mid-step. Ryan felt a sudden rush of warmth against his hand, Max's tongue, barely brushing against his skin. It was faint, so faint, but it was there. Ryan sucked in a breath, staring in disbelief. Max? Max didn't lift his head, didn't open his eyes fully, but his paw twitched again, his body responding to something deep inside him, something no one could explain. Ryan looked up at Dr. Evans, his eyes desperate for an answer, but the vet looked just as stunned. Ryan's pulse raced as a single tear slipped from Max's half-closed eyes. His best friend, his protector, was still here, and he wasn't done fighting yet. Ryan's mind was racing. Was this real? Just moments ago, Max had been slipping away, his body lifeless, the steady rhythm of the monitors fading into slow, hollow beeps. But now, his paw had moved. Ryan wiped his face quickly, his breath unsteady, watching his best friend with wide, desperate eyes. Max's body was still weak, still fragile, but his paw had twitched again. His breathing, though faint, seemed to steady just a little more. Ryan wasn't imagining it. Max was holding on. Dr. Evans stepped forward, glancing at the vitals displayed on the monitor. This doesn't make sense, he muttered under his breath. Ryan swallowed hard, his hand still gripping Max's. What does that mean? The vet hesitated. It means he's fighting. Ryan let out a shaky breath. That was all he needed to hear. The room was silent except for the faint sounds of the machines and the occasional rustling of medical staff in the hallway. Ryan leaned in, his fingers brushing lightly over Max's fur. His dog, his best friend, had always been a fighter. 12 years together. A lifetime of loyalty, protection, and love. Ryan remembered the countless nights Max had curled up beside him after long days. The way his dog had always sensed when something was wrong, always staying by his side without needing to be asked. And now, when it was Ryan's turn to be there for him, Max was still holding on. A deep sigh left Ryan's lips as he sat back slightly, his body stiff from hours of being hunched over. He hadn't moved from the spot since they'd rushed Max to the clinic. Dr. Evans adjusted the IV line, his face still uncertain. We need to be realistic, Ryan. His condition hasn't changed significantly. We don't know how long. Ryan cut him off. Don't say it. The vet hesitated. Ryan's voice was softer this time. I know the odds, but I also know him. Dr. Evans sighed, but nodded. Then we keep watching. Ryan turned back to Max, his grip tightening slightly. The silence stretched on. Then, suddenly, Max let out a weak, barely audible whimper. Ryan's heart stopped for a second. His dog had made a sound. A small one, but it was there. Ryan sat up straighter, his pulse racing. Max, buddy, I'm here. His voice was softer now, steady despite the storm of emotions building inside him. Max's ears flicked, just slightly, as if he was trying to react but didn't have the strength. Tears welled in Ryan's eyes again, but this time they weren't just from grief. They were from hope. The minutes stretched into an hour. Ryan didn't move. He just sat there, holding Max's paw, watching him, willing him to stay. Then, another movement. Max's tail shifted. A weak, almost unnoticeable motion against the blanket beneath him. Ryan gasped softly. You see that? He turned to Dr. Evans, who had been quietly observing. The vet frowned, but there was a hint of something else in his eyes now, something Ryan hadn't seen before. Surprise. Dr. Evans cleared his throat. He shouldn't be able to do that in his condition. Ryan looked back down at Max, his fingers pressing against the rough fur of his best friend's paw. But he did. The machines continued their slow, rhythmic beeping. The air felt heavier than before, but not in the same way. This time, it wasn't the weight of goodbye. It was the weight of a fight that wasn't over yet. Ryan leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. That's my boy. And then, for the first time since they had arrived at the clinic, Max let out a slow, shaky breath and tried to lift his head. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. Max's head barely lifted, his movements sluggish, as if his body was too weak to obey his own instincts. His eyes flickered, heavy-lidded, still clouded with exhaustion, but there was something in them. Something Ryan hadn't seen in hours. Awareness. It was faint. It was fragile, but it was there. Ryan's hands tightened around Max's paw, his heart racing. That's it, buddy. I'm right here. His voice was steady, but his chest ached with emotions he couldn't contain. Dr. Evans, who had remained quiet for the past few minutes, finally stepped forward, eyes trained on the vital monitors. "This is unexpected," he murmured, adjusting the IV. He was fading, but now he's stabilizing. Ryan barely heard him. His entire focus was on Max. And then Max made another sound, a soft, hoarse whimper. Ryan swallowed hard. 12 years. 12 years of unconditional love, of loyalty, of never leaving each other's side. And now, even when his body was failing, Max was still trying. Ryan exhaled shakily. "You don't give up, do you?" The German Shepherd's ear twitched slightly at his voice. Just the smallest response, but it made Ryan's chest tighten even more. Max was still here, and he was fighting. Dr. Evans ran a hand through his graying hair, still watching the monitors. "This is unusual," he muttered. His vitals were dropping fast earlier, but now he's maintaining a pulse strong enough to keep going. Ryan's fingers curled tighter around Max's paw. "That's because he's not ready," he murmured. "I know him. He's a fighter." The vet sighed, shaking his head. "We still don't know what's happening internally. The damage might be too severe." Ryan didn't look away from Max. "He just needs time." Dr. Evans hesitated, then nodded. "Time is something we can give him." Ryan let out a slow breath, his chest still tight with fear. But for the first time all night, there was something else creeping in. Hope. The minutes stretched on. Ryan stayed by Max's side, refusing to move. The clinic staff came and went, checking the machines, adjusting the IV, monitoring his vitals. But Ryan barely acknowledged them. His world had narrowed down to one thing: Max. His breathing was still slow, still uneven, but it wasn't shallow anymore. It wasn't fading. Ryan lifted a hand, brushing his fingers gently through the fur on Max's head. "Remember that time you got caught in the river?" he whispered, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. Max didn't move, but Ryan kept talking. "I thought I lost you that day," he murmured. "But you came back. You always come back." His throat tightened. "So don't stop now." The room fell silent again. And then Max let out a deep, slow exhale. Ryan tensed, not because it was weak, but because it was steady. Dr. Evans straightened, his brows furrowed as he studied the machines. "That's interesting," he muttered under his breath. Ryan's head snapped up. "What?" The vet hesitated. Then, after a long pause, he said something Ryan never expected to hear. "He's improving." Ryan's chest tightened, his fingers gripping Max's fur. His best friend, his everything, wasn't done fighting. Not yet. The clinic room was still, the air thick with uncertainty. The beeping of the monitor had steadied, no longer the slow, ominous rhythm from before. Ryan barely moved, his eyes locked on Max, whose frail body remained curled on the table. His breathing was deeper now, not labored the way it had been before. His ears flicked slightly, responding to the sound of Ryan's voice. But Ryan knew this wasn't over. Dr. Evans was still watching the monitors, his expression unreadable. His fingers hovered over the chart, tapping the edge of the clipboard. Ryan's voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. "You said he was improving." The vet nodded. "He is, but the question is, how much?" Ryan swallowed, glancing down at Max. He lifted his head. He moved. "He knows I'm here." His voice was stronger now, filled with something that had been missing for hours. Hope. Dr. Evans sighed. "I won't lie to you, Ryan. He's still extremely weak, but there's something keeping him here." Ryan exhaled shakily, his fingers brushing over Max's fur. "I know what it is." The room felt different now. The crushing weight of inevitability had lifted, just slightly, but it was enough. Ryan sat back in his chair, exhaustion settling into his bones. He had barely noticed how stiff his body had become, his back aching from being hunched over for so long. He didn't care. Max was still here, and that was all that mattered. He reached out, running his hand along Max's side. The rise and fall of his ribs was slow but steady. It was fragile, but it was life. A faint whimper broke the silence. Ryan's breath hitched as he looked down. Max's paw twitched again, his claws barely scraping the table. It was stronger this time. Ryan sucked in a shaky breath. Hey, buddy. I'm here. Max didn't lift his head, but he moved again, shifting slightly, his body reacting to the sound of Ryan's voice. Tears burned behind Ryan's eyes. He had spent the last few hours thinking he was going to lose him. But now there was something else. A flicker of what had always made Max who he was. Fight. Dr. Evans took a step closer, his eyes scanning the vitals again. This doesn't make sense, he muttered under his breath. Ryan tensed. What? The vet hesitated. His oxygen levels are stabilizing. They shouldn't be. His body was shutting down before, but now... He trailed off, shaking his head. Ryan's fingers tightened around Max's fur. He heard me, Ryan whispered. That's why. Dr. Evans exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Maybe. Or maybe this is just temporary. Ryan didn't believe that. Not for a second. Because Max had never given up on him before. And he wasn't giving up now. Ryan wiped his face, blinking back the overwhelming emotion clawing at his chest. I'm not leaving, he murmured. Dr. Evans nodded. I didn't expect you to. Ryan didn't move from his seat. He didn't look away from Max. Because deep down, he knew. Max wasn't done fighting. And neither was he. Ryan's fingers never left Max's fur. The warmth beneath his touch was weak. But it was there. His dog, his best friend, was still breathing. Still fighting. The room had settled into a heavy silence, broken only by the steady beeping of the monitor. Dr. Evans stood nearby, his eyes darting between the machines and Max's fragile body. His fingers hovered over his clipboard, but he wasn't writing anymore. Something had changed. Ryan saw it. He felt it. Max was holding on. The hours blurred together. The night had stretched too long, exhaustion settling into every part of Ryan's body. But he refused to move. He barely noticed the weight of time pressing down on him. All that mattered was Max. His dog hadn't moved much since the moment he tried to lift his head. His eyes remained half closed, his body too weak to do more than exist. But he was still here, and Ryan wasn't going anywhere. At some point, a soft noise filled the room. Ryan's breath hitched. He looked down. Max had let out a slow, deep sigh. It wasn't a whimper. It wasn't a sound of pain. It was something else. Something Ryan hadn't heard in hours. Relief. Max's body shifted, just slightly, his ribs expanding with a deeper breath than before. Ryan swallowed, his hand pressing against the side of his best friend. "Attaboy," he whispered, his voice barely above a breath. Dr. Evans moved closer, adjusting the IV. "He's still weak, Ryan. But this is different." Ryan nodded, not trusting himself to speak, because for the first time all night, Max didn't look like he was slipping away. He looked like he was trying to come back. The vet checked the machines again, his expression unreadable. Ryan finally broke the silence. "Tell me the truth. What do you see?" Dr. Evans hesitated, then, with a sigh, he spoke. "I see a dog that should have been gone hours ago," he admitted. "And yet, he's still here." Ryan let out a shaky breath. "That's Max." Dr. Evans folded his arms, studying the German Shepherd with quiet fascination. "I've seen dogs hold on for their owners before," he murmured. "But this is different." Ryan didn't care about science. He didn't care about statistics. He cared about one thing only, Max. And Max was fighting. The next hour passed in silence. Ryan stayed exactly where he was, his hand never leaving Max's fur. His thumb traced gentle patterns along his best friend's coat, grounding himself in the simple reality that Max was still breathing. Then, another movement. It was slow, almost unnoticeable, but Ryan felt it. Max's tail twitched. Ryan's heart pounded. He sucked in a breath, blinking fast. "Did you see that?" His voice cracked as he looked up at Dr. Evans. The vet nodded slowly. "Yeah, I did." The air in the room shifted. This was not just survival anymore. This was something else. Something no one could explain. Ryan's fingers curled slightly around Max's paw, his voice a whisper. "You're not done, are you, buddy?" Max didn't answer, but he didn't need to, because deep down, Ryan already knew. Max wasn't giving up, and neither was he. The clinic room was silent, except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor. The air was thick with exhaustion, uncertainty, and something else. Hope. Ryan had spent the last few hours watching Max slip away. He had prepared himself for the worst. But now, Max was still here. His breathing was deeper, his body still weak, but no longer motionless. His tail had twitched, his ears had flicked, and for the first time in hours, Ryan swore he saw a flicker of life in his tired brown eyes. Ryan held onto his paw, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're fighting, aren't you, buddy?" Max exhaled slowly, his body shifting just slightly against the blanket. Ryan's chest tightened painfully. It wasn't much, but it was everything. Dr. Evans stepped forward, his brows furrowed in cautious disbelief. He checked the machines, his lips pressed together, as if searching for a reason, a medical explanation for what was happening. But there wasn't one. Max was doing something no one expected. He was fighting his way back. The vet exhaled sharply. "I don't know how, but..." He looked up at Ryan. "He's stabilizing." Ryan let out a shaky breath, his fingers threading gently through Max's fur. He had believed in his best friend, and now Max was proving him right. The minutes stretched into an hour. Ryan didn't move. He just sat there, holding on to Max, whispering to him, telling him about the long hikes they used to take, the afternoons they spent chasing after a ball, the way Max always knew when Ryan needed him most. And then, out of nowhere, a sound, soft, raspy, but unmistakable. A whimper. Ryan's head snapped up. Max had made a sound. His chest rose and fell steadily now. His ears flicked just slightly, and then his paw moved. Not the faint twitch from before. A real, deliberate stretch. Ryan sucked in a breath, his throat tight. "Max?" His voice cracked. Slowly, painfully slowly, Max's head moved. Ryan froze. He could barely breathe as he watched his best friend do the impossible. Max lifted his head, just barely, but enough to look at him. Their eyes met, and Ryan lost it. Tears spilled down his face as he let out a shaky laugh. You stubborn old man." Max didn't wag his tail. He didn't have the strength, but he blinked. Slow, tired. But there. Ryan let out a breath that felt like he had been holding in for hours. He had begged for a sign, and Max had given him one. Dr. Evans let out a quiet exhale, shaking his head in disbelief. "I have no idea how..." He trailed off, staring at the German Shepherd who was supposed to be gone by now. Ryan wiped his face, still gripping Max's paw, because he wasn't ready. The vet nodded slowly. "Looks like you were right." Ryan smiled through the tears. "I told you. He's a fighter." The hours stretched into morning. The first hints of sunlight crept through the clinic window, casting a soft glow on Max's fur. His breathing was slow, steady. Ryan stayed beside him the entire time. And when Max finally drifted into sleep, no longer gasping, no longer fighting just to stay alive, Ryan knew. Max wasn't just surviving. He was coming back. And this wasn't goodbye. Not today. Not yet. Because the ones we love never truly leave us. And Max, he still had more life to live. Max's story is a reminder that love, loyalty, and the unbreakable bond between a dog and its owner can defy all odds. When everyone had given up, Max held on. Because sometimes, the ones we rescue end up rescuing us. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes in the power of love and second chances. And if you've ever had a dog who changed your life, tell us their story in the comments below. We'd love to hear it.